I'm pleased to introduce Elizabeth Rosenthal, whose books include his song, The Musical Journey of Elton John, and Birdwatcher, The Life of Roger Tory Peterson, and of course, today's book that we are discussing, The Master of Drums, Gene Krupa, and the Music He Gave the World. So welcome, Liz. It's so good to have you.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here.
I guess one question that I would start with was, how did you become interested in Gene Krupa?
Well, it's a long and a short story. Basically, it started with my becoming interested in big band music, which happened around the time I was about 12 years old, which was in 1972. And I was kind of weird in that, I didn't listen to the current hits at the time. I kind of rejected that. And because I discovered this little floppy record in a magazine that advertised the big band era, with all the different major band leaders like Benny Goodman and Glenn Miller, etc. Uh, I became fascinated by it and started buying records, LPs, with my little bit of uh, allowance, very little allowance that I had. And eventually, when I discovered Benny Goodman, I then discovered Gene Krupa, because his rise to national fame happened while he was playing with Benny Goodman. He joined the Goodman Group in December 1934. And so in listening to the Carnegie Hall Jazz Concert from 1938, which was one of the several Goodman records that I got, it's an incredible thing anyway, with his Benny Goodman's uh, orchestra and trio and quartet that also included Gene Krupa, and the guest stars, some of which he came from the Count Basie Orchestra. But anyway, Gene Krupa dominated throughout this recording. And in particular, the real highlight, the pièce de résistance, if you will, was Sing, 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 which I think, even if you aren't particularly interested in big band music or swing, you probably have heard it, because it's been in so many featured in so many TV shows, even movies and commercials, TV commercials, and even some games, computer games. So it's kind of everywhere, and it's sort of uh, it's part of the fabric of our culture. And anyway, the point is, getting back to Gene Krupa in particular, he I was just mesmerized by his style of playing, the sort of aggression, the passion, the duende, which I discuss that in my book. The concept being that anybody who has it, any artist who has it, is uh, sort of they're expressing whatever they're doing with their whole being from the inside out. And this is the only way they can do it. And it's a very honest thing. And Gene Krupa was often criticized for perhaps overdoing it in the showmanship department. But it was the only way he knew how to do it. He played passionately. He played physically, beyond just pounding the drums. His body was into it. He was dancing on his seat while he was playing. So he was just an amazing musician and drummer. And so that's how I discovered him.
Yeah, and despite the critics, as you wrote, uh, the audience loved him for that.
Yes,
The public loved it. Um,
yes.
Now, The Master of Drums, the title, how did you give it that title? How was Krupa considered a master?
Well, actually, the title is something that I worked on with my editor at Citadel Press.
Hmm.
Um, how was he a master? Well, it's something that drums were something that he began his journey with at the age of 11, back in 1920. Wow. And he was a lifelong a student of the drums. No matter how great he was at the drums, no matter how impactful he was on other drummers, and how much he was admired by his fellow drummers, he always felt there was something else to learn. He was always going to people who could teach him, including his students, which is kind of sounds strange, but no matter what was going on, he felt there was always something else, another viewpoint, another technique, whatever it was, to find out about, or maybe to brush up on, or whatever it was. But in particular, his being a master, he uh, he practiced, especially early on in the early 30s. He practiced for 8 to 10 hours a day, up until the time when he would have to work with a particular orchestra that he was in. He was incredibly devoted to it, and he was just constantly or continually developing his technique. And we're talking, not, I'm not just talking about, say, tippy tappy kind of stuff, but in other words, every kind of sound that you could get out of the drums. I mean, he was interested in creating those sounds and creating new sounds. And uh, the other thing is he developed and basically invented the way the drum kit as it is known today, and is almost universally used by any drummer you'll see anywhere. And it's not a very big drum kit, but it gets the job done. Basically, a snare, a rack tom tom, which is a smaller tom tom that's in in the in the hardware up above, yeah. And there's a floor tom, of course, a bass drum, and then, well, he used a cowbell. Uh,
Yeah.
yeah, and
And the symbol.
well, absolutely, three to four cymbals. The ride cymbal, crash cymbal, splash cymbal. Of course, uh, the any that and those are the things that he utilized to create all the sounds he could think of, and he did it by himself, and it sounded like there was an awful lot going on for just one person to be doing.
And little do people know this, that today's drum setup worldwide
Yes,
comes from him and his suggestions
yes,
to Slingerland, right? He was the
yes,
Slingerland spokesman. Wow.
yes.
Now,
From
yep,
1936 until 1967.
it's a long time. You had mentioned Sing Sing Sing, which I think put him on the map. How did he become so famous?
The interesting thing is that uh, it was a two-way street. He was selected by Benny Goodman, who actually had to recruit somebody else named John Hammond, who he was sort of his like a talent scout without portfolio, in the sense that he was always thinking of trying to get different musicians for different bands that he was interested in promoting or helping them to become successful. So
Mhm.
Gene Krupa, who already had played with Benny Goodman in other groups, they weren't necessarily friends, because Goodman was kind of hard to get along with. Unfortunately, his people skills were not too good. But anyway, John Hammond persuaded Gene to please come, because Benny Goodman's drummer at the time was basically totally inadequate, very boring. And Gene Krupa already, at least in New York City, was very well known as a drummer and in demand. Whether it was whether he played in the pit orchestra for a Broadway musical, or anyone else needed him for any period of time. So, and he was already noticed by the critics as somebody who was kind of very noticeable on stage. Uh, one reviewer said he must be the comedian of the band. And so anyway, so when he was brought in, and he was told he could feature his drums, which he wanted to hear, almost immediately he made himself known. And this was even before the Benny Goodman band his uh, had its great success or its total stardom and the beginning of the big band era in August of 1935. Gene Krupa was, of course, became a big star then, but he was also instrumental in getting Benny Goodman to where he got. That is the Benny Goodman Orchestra. Full of ideas, drawing people, drawing music fans in, creating new music fans or swing fans, that is. Uh, and so uh, he was, on the one hand, instrumental in in bringing success to the Benny Goodman band, and the Benny Goodman band also at the same time helped him to get his own celebrity out. So it was kind of a two-way street in a way.
And yet he and Benny Goodman kind of had a love-hate relationship, right? Like,
Yeah, I think well, most of the musicians who worked with Benny Goodman, unfortunately, either didn't like him or were afraid of him or both. He
mhm.
was he's just not a warm person, and he was a very rough taskmaster. There were some who were not intimidated by him, who had, I guess, the strong enough personalities to overcome their fear of him, and Gene Krupa was one of them. Uh, but the reason that one of the reasons, I guess the main reason they had a problem during the time Gene was with um, Benny Goodman was that Benny Goodman wanted Gene to play brushes,
Mhm.
uh, uh, wire brushes, which are, obviously softer and less loud than drumsticks. And Gene was always having this conflict with Benny and not wanting to just play with brushes. And sometimes he said, okay, well, if I'm going to play brushes, I'm going to play really loud brushes. He somehow figured out how to do that. Uh, so that's really the basic conflict that they had, and continued throughout the time Gene was with the Benny Goodman band.
And interestingly, he had an influence on rock and roll, which you could tell us about, but that
Mhm.
he didn't like rock and roll and that
No,
he thought that the drums in rock and roll were too loud, even though the critics were saying that
yeah,
Krupa was too loud.
yes, yes,
That
I
was
know, and
pretty
that's
interesting to learn.
it is kind of ironic in a way. I assume that when Gene was saying that he probably thought that the rock drums were even louder than his drums. Now he didn't say that, but and he said, well, the reason that rock drummers have to play so loud is to overcome the extremely loud electric guitars,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
really dominated. Yeah, he didn't like rock, but he did like the drummers. He found out that a number of rock drummers would have, if they had their druthers, they would have been playing jazz, but there was no money in it anymore. I mean, especially by the 60s, uh, jazz went through its worst crisis in a sense because of enormous lessening of interest and popularity. Um, but the main thing is uh, soon to be or future rock drummers were mesmerized by his drumming and were influenced by his drumming and inspired to take up the drums very often. And a lot of it had to do with their going as boys, they would they might go to see the Gene Krupa story, which was the biopic that was made of his life and came out in 1959. So that was a key time for kids growing up, boys growing up, who would soon be joining rock groups um, and people like Keith Moon. If it weren't for Gene Krupa, Keith Moon would not have been a drummer. And Keith Moon patterned his playing, his incredibly loud, uh, just I guess earth-shattering, in-your-face drumming. He based that on Gene's own playing. And also the same with John Bonham of Led Zeppelin, who also he considered Gene Krupa God, and Ringo Starr too, who incredibly hugely admired him. And you can hear influence on Ringo Starr from Gene's playing in certain aspects of Gene's playing during, say, even the 1940s. Certain aspects of his playing seem to sound like, a precursor to rock and roll. Um, and there's so many other rock drummers or future rock drummers, uh, and aside from the rock groups, you had people like session musicians like Steve Gadd, who's played on everything, from Paul Simon to, I don't know, Chick Corea and everybody in between, and you had Hal Blaine, who played on, I don't know, hundreds or possibly thousands of popular recordings in the 60s and 70s. The Mamas and the Papas and Simon and Garfunkel. But the point is that Hal Blaine got his inspiration from Gene Krupa as a kid and tried to emulate him. And so Hal Blaine's drumming, which was influenced by Gene Krupa, uh, became the drumming that people heard on almost every pop song out there. Aside from the rock groups, which had their own drummers. So that's really how it happened. And sometimes the boys that had developed their interest. Sometimes it was because their parents brought in big band music and even say sing, sing, sing into the household.
It sounds like there would not have been such a thing as a drum solo had it
Hmm.
not been for Krupa, because drummers were just expected to keep the rhythm for the rest of the band prior to
Yes.
him.
Yes, that's right. He brought, as some people like to say, he brought drums out to the forefront of the band. Before that, they were kind of buried in the back and not really thought of too well. And one anecdote that Gene Krupa liked to tell was that the drummer for a band usually got blamed if anything went wrong with the band's performance. Even if a trumpeter say hit a wrong note,
Mhm.
then it would be blamed on the drummer, and then the drummer would be punished by having to sort of sweep down the stage after the performance and sort of pack everything up. So he was almost like the janitor of the band.
And he's from Chicago.
Yes,
Originally, you let us know that he began learning drums in Chicago when he
right.
was quite young. And it seems like Gangland Chicago was not just the Hollywood fiction as we see it today, because you wrote about it in the book and it sounded like it was a reality for him
Yes,
as a
that's right.
musician in clubs and speakeasies. What was Chicago like for him, and how did he
Well,
survive it?
well, how he survived it, I don't know. I guess he had to learn the ins and outs. He was with a group of young white musicians. They sort of were loosely called, they could be called the Condon Mob, named after Eddie Condon, a guitar player who Gene Krupa ended up becoming lifelong friends with. But the reason that he was with a white group of musicians, young people who were starved for playing jazz because it was not something that the white community was really interested in, and they didn't understand it. So, and society was segregated at the time, and it was still segregated for decades, for decades after that. But so they couldn't play professionally with African Americans. But these boys, including Gene, could go to these black clubs and sort of listen to what the musicians were playing, as well as the drummers. Gene, of course, being totally fascinated by the drummers. And so they all sort of learned their craft through studying these African American musicians, and Gene Krupa uh, being fascinated by the drummers. like Baby Dots and Zooey Singleton and others. And a lot of these Black musicians had come up from New Orleans. And so they brought their particular style up to Chicago. And Gene Krupa and his friends sort of took it to another level by what it ended up being called the Chicago and well, the Chicago Sound or the Chicagoans. They were the Chicagoans. Uh, but as far as gangland issues, they all had to deal with that. A lot of times the mobsters owned the clubs, and actually they tended to be speakeasies, of course, because um, alcohol was, illegal. So,
Uh,
so yeah, they would, as Gene Krupa himself said, that uh, if the mobsters, for whatever reason, decided um, to not pay the musicians that they had hired for the speakeasy or the club, then they just wouldn't pay them. And Gene and the other guys wouldn't really be able to do anything about it because these are mobsters. Uh, how do you stand up to a mobster? But on the other hand, I mean, apparently these mobsters, including Al Capone and other very well-known names. They often liked the jazz very much, and so the one challenge was for Gene Krupa and the others to be able to play what they wanted. And as I said, the white people didn't necessarily understand the jazz, and they weren't necessarily interested. Uh, if the guys could get a job actually playing jazz, they were totally over the moon about it. Um, and if they couldn't, then they would sort of play after hours and jam and just jam all night long, and drink illegal booze and things like that. Um,
mhm.
so yeah, it was a tough town, Chicago, in that sense, but it was also a very bustling place and full of promise with jazz being developed and uh, and future stars like Gene Krupa and some of his other friends like Dave Tuff and George Wetling and of course Eddie Condon, Jimmy McPartland. All these guys eventually moved over to New York and began influencing the New York scene. And so, well, I probably answered a little too much, more than you wanted to necessarily know, but I guess that's the story.
No, that was good. That answered other upcoming questions, which I don't need to ask now, because I was wondering, like, stepping back a little bit, um, where did jazz originate? You did mention that he's a pioneer of jazz. He's one of the pioneers. So there was Chicago, there was New Orleans. Did it develop separately or in
Yeah,
different places?
I
Mm,
mean, I think that some researchers have referred to the possibility that jazz developed not only in New Orleans, but perhaps elsewhere. But I mean, I think it started in New Orleans and just branched out. Uh, and when all these African American jazz musicians had to leave New Orleans because I guess there was a crackdown on I guess what you would call vice, and because I suppose the clubs down there were allegedly engaging in things that were not necessarily legal. Uh, so people like Louis Armstrong and uh, and so many others. Just trying to think. Uh, they came up from New Orleans and they ended up in Chicago. It's kind of remarkable that that's where they ended up going. Basically, when they went up the Mississippi River and they ended up in Chicago. And so that was a wonderful fortune for music fans and young guys like Gene Krupa. Uh, Imagine Louis Armstrong showing up. He wasn't famous quite yet when he first showed up in Chicago, but he his reputation just, exploded. But can you imagine being able to say jam with Louis Armstrong, which Gene Krupa was eventually able to do? Uh, it blows your mind. Um, but so, there were other branches of jazz, which probably came from New Orleans that ended up, say, in Baltimore, Maryland, and New York City. And uh, everything kind of came together um, once the Chicagoans and African Americans from New Orleans ended up in New York. Uh, and so that's a short sort of way of looking at it. But the thing is that Gene Krupa was sort of on the um, later end uh, of the development of jazz. In other words, by say 1927, 1928, he was influencing other drummers, even in New York, because Gene Krupa and his friends started recording in Chicago, and these new sounds uh, got were transmitted via record to New York, and drummers and other musicians there were um, just they felt that there was a new incredible thing that they were hearing. So Gene Krupa and his friends, called the Chicagoans, uh, were among the sort of last of the pioneers. Uh,
Mhm.
and so, yes, Gene Krupa was a pioneer of jazz.
Okay, we have a question from Maddie, but before I get to her question, I have more of a question, and then I'll get to you. So your chapters about his time in New York were really enthralling and gave a sense of what life was like there at the time. And it also introduced us to many more names from the era, some well known to the average Joe, like George Gershwin, some
Oh,
not. And not to mention the popular Broadway shows at the time and others not known by the average person. What would you say were his most significant musical adventures and influences during his time, especially maybe around the Great Depression?
yeah. Well, they went over to he and others went over to New York just before the crash, and they stayed, and they kind of starved a bit because it was hard to get work. Um, Ended up often just eating a can of tomatoes, which was all they could scrounge up. But yeah, a group of them were hired by Red Nichols, who was viewed as being one of the only band leaders who was trying to make a go out of playing actual jazz. And so uh, Gene Krupa and Eddie Condon and there were others too who actually didn't play with him, but that was one thing. Red Nichols' sound ended up being groundbreaking, influential with people like Gene Krupa. And and actually, it was because of Gene's association with Red Nichols that he got to be the pit orchestra drummer for two major George Gershwin musicals, Strike Up the Band and Girl Crazy. And are a lot of songs that came out of those two musicals that have sort of become uh, standards of today. Well, standards for the last several decades.
Hmm.
Um, and
Like the Great
also
American Songbook. Yeah.
the Great American Songbook, yeah. And that was another thing. He also uh, his he his style of playing was sort of brought to the attention of, or George Gershwin was particularly interested and impressed by Gene's mode of drumming, and so they had some interaction about that. And so, and the interesting thing also about those two musicals, in particular, Strike Up the Band January 1930, was the first Broadway musical of the 1930s. So Gene Krupa was the drummer in playing in the first Broadway musical of the 1930s. Uh, he had other firsts. For example, he was, Ethel Merman had her debut on the Broadway stage, um, and in Strike Up the Band. So Gene Krupa was actually her first drummer. She had never been in theater before, strangely enough. Um, and a couple of years later, when Billie Holiday came on the scene in New York, Gene Krupa ended up being her first drummer. Well, that is her first drummer on a recording. So there are all these firsts that a lot of people don't know about. Um, I don't know. I probably went off track with what you were asking me. Uh, but he had a lot of, yeah, adventures. Yeah, he had a lot of adventures playing with different bands that he didn't necessarily like, but he needed to make ends meet. Uh, in particular, I guess Buddy Rogers, who nobody knows today, but he was kind of a famous movie star at the time. And Gene played with him, but Buddy Rogers was a very embarrassing band leader because Buddy Rogers thought that he could play every instrument very well. And so there would be a point during the show where Buddy Rogers would go around to each band member's instrument and take it and play a solo. It was terrible. And at one point, Buddy Rogers took Gene's drums and played something on them. And Gene Krupa almost got fired because he went backstage after the show to tell Buddy Rogers, listen, if you want to play solo, I can show you a good 16 bars, you know, a decent 16 bars. Buddy Rogers was very offended and almost fired him on the spot, but others dissuaded him from doing that. So, so anyway, those were interesting experiences that he had at the time. Yes.
Oh, wow. So here's from our chat. Hi guys, this is Maddie. I just want to say that this was a wonderful interview with great questions by Jeff and great storytelling by Liz. Thank you for this. Oh, thank you, Maddie. Just one question, Liz. Do you have a favorite rock drummer? And if so, why?
Oh, well, I think just in terms of, yeah, I guess Keith Moon, just because he was such an exciting player, and he really drove the rock band The Who, and he really was an integral part of their sound, which was kind of an earth-shattering sound.
Hmm.
Um, and as far as other rock drummers, um, one drummer that perhaps a lot of people haven't heard of is Ray Cooper, who played a lot with Elton John over the years. And he was somebody who played the drum kit, he played congas, he played everything, and almost always stole the show. I was always very impressed with him. So those are actual favorites, but I Steve Gadd was great. If you listen to Paul Simon's 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover, you'll hear Steve Gadd's snare drum sort of
Hmm.
introducing the song. It's a very interesting way to introduce the song, and he did it uh, in a very unforgettable way. So I guess that's an overview of rock drummers that I like.
Yeah. And I was going to ask another question, but I saw another question that I want to ask. So that I think related to jazz maybe was swing and was it the Palomar in
Yeah,
LA? Was
yeah,
that the birth of swing? And
yes,
what was the role of of swing, of the radio, the timing, etc.?
yeah. Well, it wasn't so much that swing was invented in August of 1935, or August
Mhm.
21st, 1935. It was just that that's when it became a national phenomenon, which is something that is due to Benny Goodman and his orchestra's debut at the Palomar Ballroom in Los Angeles. And despite the great music that his band was playing with Gene Krupa uh, and other great musicians like Jess Stacy on piano, Alan Alan Roos on guitar, and Harry Goodman on bass, etc. Well, they had a really rough going after the radio show that they had success with in New York called Let's Dance. They had a 6 month uh, gig essentially, and it was a nationally broadcast, and it was popular. But then it was just canceled essentially, and so Benny Goodman and the band had to find other things to keep them in the public eye. They ended up going west on their way to the Palomar, and going west, it was a pretty sad affair because the places that they played, people uh, didn't care for what Benny Goodman was playing, and it was just very demoralizing. When they got to Los Angeles, on the other hand, it seemed like the fans were waiting for them, and their popularity just exploded. Benny Goodman and his orchestra, popularity just went off the charts, and uh, it's hard to say exactly why, except that it seemed like young people in particular, were just ready for something new and different. Uh, and perhaps the Let's Dance radio program was broadcast at just the right time on Saturday nights for young people to listen to it for, during their Saturday night dance parties. Um, Now, swing itself was something that sort of evolved out of jazz. Swing is a form of jazz. It evolved out of jazz and really kind of got its start with African American bands, including Duke Ellington uh, and Chick Webb, who both of whom played in New York City. Um, but the point is that it did not have a white fan base. And it also, just generally speaking, was not nationally known. So Benny Goodman's band, it played swing, and they're the ones uh, who we can thank for the breakthrough of swing as a national phenomenon.
And there was swing dancing.
Yeah.
I remember taking lessons and learning that for Hollywood, there was a way to perform the dance because of the angle of the camera. That one person had to stand here, one person had to stand here, and the camera was here.
Oh,
I thought it was pretty interesting. And swing was in Hollywood movies
yeah.
for
It
sure,
eventually, but
you know?
pretty. Not long after Benny Goodman and his orchestra became famous nationally and introduced swing to a national audience. Yes, it was in a lot of movies, featured in a lot of movies. It kind of really, that helps it also further popularize swing. Um, but you may be thinking of jitterbugging. Jitterbug was a particular kind of very exciting dance that was actually invented at the Savoy Ballroom in Harlem. And You had African American dancers who, uh, I mean, I don't even know how to describe that sort of dancing, but it was sort of an unprecedented, extremely exciting form of dancing that also involves some improvisation of improvisational dancing.
Mhm.
Um, and again, that's another thing that sort of started, say, in Harlem, but then when swing became a national thing, everybody was dancing jitterbug, and so um, That's about as much as I can say. I mean, I'm not a dancer. I don't. I just know if I like something, and I certainly enjoy seeing Jitterbug and other similar dances that they had at the time.
Like if you don't enjoy dancing yourself, watching it performed sometimes can be really fun as well.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, the book was very intricate, a lot of details, great chronology, and there were various bands doing similar or different things at the time. But was it a challenge to find out, as a researcher, how they moved from a movie set to then going back to playing in clubs? Like in a
Um,
day. You were talking
oh
about
my
their
God.
day.
Oh no. Well, yeah, back in the 30s in particular, there weren't as many sort of I don't know what would you call it, rules or regulations on the part of the music union. Eventually, these things became a bit more doable for musicians. But Benny Goodman's band, during that time, if they were in LA, like let's say 1936, they went back to LA and had an even greater time at and more success at the Palomar. But that was also an opportunity to be in their first movie, and which was the big broadcast of 1938. Well, big broadcast of 1936, I think. Um, and so yeah, the band had to do that. They had to get up really early and get made up and do their thing in front of the cameras. But they also had late night gigs at different other ballrooms and movie theaters where bands tended to play in between the showings of the movies. Sometimes they traveled around to nearby towns or in the general region. Gene and the others were incredibly exhausted and, could almost just fall asleep sitting in a chair. It was very rough, but fortunately, they were all quite young, in their 20s. And people ought to hopefully be aware that these were not old guys or something. Like, I think sort of the modern, I think, viewpoint about jazz guys is that they were all kind of old or something. Well, they became old later, but they started out as young and excited about what they were doing and full of energy and full of experimentation. Anyway, the it was very fortunate for the band and all the jazz different swing bands that they were very young and could sort of take the hard life, which is what it was.
And it was a thing that I didn't know about. Maybe I heard about it and forgot. But in a movie theater, they would show a movie, but then the young people would go to the movie, not only to see the movie, but to see who
Mhm.
was playing at the movie, what orchestra, what band.
Yes, that's right. And that began in the mid to late 30s and went through World War II and even a bit beyond. Um, it was something that was sort of kind of an outgrowth of the Great Depression and a way for the movie theater operators to attract more people to movies by having bands come in. And imagine that. Yeah, and these movies would have showings starting in the early morning, going until, you know, like 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night. And in between the movies, you would have the big bands. You'd have a bit of what might be called vaudeville, also with different acts doing stuff like whether they were telling jokes or doing acrobatics and stuff like that. Uh, but it it it, it generally when you talked about the success of different movie theaters, for example, in New York or any major city. It seemed that it was really down to the uh, the attractive the attractiveness of bands playing in between the movies, and you had kids who started skipping school, high school kids, or even maybe junior high kids, and they would start assembling early in the morning, skipping school, and maybe bringing their lunch with them or something, and with lines snaking around the blocks, and because they all wanted to get in as early as possible, and then they would in many cases stay all day for every single showing, and all the multiple performances of the same band. And that was the case, of course, with Benny Goodman, where in a sense his band, when again 19 this around 1937, Gene was there, they sort of broke uh, out this kind of new um, way of bringing swing to the public with their playing in movie theaters. And this was the case also when Gene Krupa went out and got his own band in 1938. And of course, he was doing the same thing. He was also playing in between showings of different movies.
And his band could help a movie become a hit, a box office smash, because
Exactly,
people went to
exactly.
see
Yes,
see the band, which I thought
yes.
was really
There was
interesting, right?
yes, a symbiotic kind of relationship. Uh, there were a couple of really big movies in during World War II and just after. Uh, One of them was called "Since
Mhm.
You Went Away," which is about people in young women, other people in the U.S. where their loved ones have gone off to fight the war and what happens to them back home since you went away. And so Gene Krupa in New York played in between showings of that. It was a very
Mhm.
long movie, so he didn't his sets, his song sets weren't as long as they might have been. Um, but it was a blockbuster movie, and Gene Krupa's band absolutely helped it along. And the same goes with the other interesting thing is, uh, the best years of our lives was another one in 1946. But um, and that was the interest. The other thing that I forgot to mention is not only did Benny Goodman, I mean, a lot of band leaders were uh, 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 playing let's see, a lot of band leaders were in movies. And Benny Goodman was, Gene Krupa, when he got his band, was. And there was a particular movie he appeared in, just one song in the movie Ball of Fire with Barbara Stanwyck and Gary Cooper. It was a comedy. And Gene Krupa's one song with his band was Drum Boogie, which is really one of the most exciting things you could ever do. I mean, in a way, it was almost more exciting than his playing on Sing Sing Sing. Uh,
Mhm.
and so that was a big thing that attracted young people just for the one thing. He was listed as a star, but he only had the one appearance in the movie, just playing drum boogie.
Well, now you also wrote about um, uh, how he integrated bands, and would you say that he was ahead of his times in terms of racial issues? I mean, we're talking about the South, Jim Crow laws versus the North, where some of them wouldn't allow,
Yeah.
a black member to be in a white band. How would you describe and characterize his actions and how he, stood up for people?
Yeah. Well, first of all, when he was still playing with Benny Goodman, and Benny Goodman got his trio and quartet together, aside from the orchestra in the 1930s, and Gene was a drummer in the trio and quartet, but Benny Goodman actually got Teddy Wilson, a piano player, and Lionel Hampton, a vibraphonist, and so they would all play together as equals. When they appeared in a movie, they were all playing as equals. There was no differentiation between them of based on race. The thing that Gene Krupa did that was particularly groundbreaking was when he got his band in 1938. He did for a time hire the singer Leo Watson, who was probably one of the possibly he was a scat singer and possibly helped to bring about or influenced bebop when it became popular later. But he was African American. But the big thing was in 1941, Gene Krupa hired Roy Eldridge, an African American trumpeter, who was a really amazing trumpeter, regardless of whether he was playing a ballad or something fast and exciting. And Gene Krupa and Roy Eldridge were also very close friends. And so Roy Eldridge was the first Black musician to be recruited into a full orchestra and sit side by side with the other musicians, which was unique and, in particular, in the South, not necessarily looked at very favorably. And the other thing that was groundbreaking was in the same year, 1941, Gene Krupa hired Anita O'Day, really great, influential singer herself. And so you had this song, Let Me Off Uptown, which was about going up to Harlem and, enjoying jazz up there and all the food and everything. And so uh, Gene Krupa had Roy Eldridge and Anita duet on this song, Let Me Off Uptown. This was amazing because this was not only an integrated performance racially, but it was a white woman and a black man. And in some quarters, particularly in the South, but even, elsewhere, the idea of seeing a white woman with a black man doing anything, what could be shocking, as hard as it is to imagine today, that was the case. And so, and so, and it is believed that the reason or an impetus for Gene Krupa having been busted for marijuana possession in 1943, it could have been in part a retribution by the feds uh, because he went or he acted out of the box and did things that were disapproved of by certain individuals running things in the FBI and Bureau of Narcotics.
Yeah, I was next going to ask you about that because cannabis uh, took its toll on him. Not necessarily his career, though, because you said that even though he was blacklisted from several places, uh, I believe Benny Goodman hired him for a band, and people
Yes,
just flocked to him. They didn't care about
yes,
his use of weed. They just
right,
liked his music.
right, and the his arrest, in a sense, a lot of people feel that the charges were trumped up uh because not very much. I might have been like half a cigarette might have been found in his hotel room or something, and allegedly his band boy, all the bands had band boys. The allegation was that he used his band boy, who was not of age, meaning not 21 yet. He used him to transport, uh, not 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 business wise, but just sort of have marijuana on his person for Gene. This was an allegation. Unfortunately, the Gene pled Gene pled guilty to the misdemeanor. There was a misdemeanor and felony on the same arising out of the same set of facts. So Gene pled on the misdemeanor, and this was on advice of his attorney. And they thought that if Gene did that, that the felony charge would go away essentially because they would have gotten the San Francisco DA, that's where the incident occurred or the
Mhm.
arrest occurred, that he would have, gotten his conviction and been happy with that. But no, unfortunately, uh, his Gene ended up going on trial for, on the felony and got a conviction. And and so, but it was overturned a year later based on double jeopardy. But during the period in between, initially Gene thought his career was over. He lost his band. He lost a lot of work opportunities. He lost a lot of money. So he went home after his 90-day plus jailing for the misdemeanor. And again, as I said, he thought his career was over and he was very embarrassed and mortified about the whole thing. Yeah, so Benny Goodman hired him for a while as a sideman. Uh, and a few months later, Tommy Dorsey hired him. And then after that, toward the middle of 1944, Gene Krupa, uh, since he won his appeal, he felt comfortable in getting his own band together again.
Yeah. Wow, there's so much more to cover here. We're coming up close to the hour because I don't know if you could briefly talk about the Ethel and
Oh,
and
yes.
how things went with her because they kind of got back together after the
Yeah,
whole, marijuana fiasco, right?
right. Well, it's interesting. They were married in 1933, and she
Where'd
was
they
sort of.
meet?
Yeah, they met in at the Dixie Hotel in New York. I don't know why it was called the
Uh-huh.
Dixie Hotel, but Ethel Fawcett was her name, and she was a phone operator who did wake up calls. And so Gene, just so happened that when Gene needed his wake up call in the afternoon, they would play all night and then sleep during the day. So Ethel would call him, and they eventually kind of became friendly on the phone, when she gave him his wake up calls. And someone pointed her out because he didn't know what she looked like. And then, he asked for a first date, and eventually they became engaged and got married. But unfortunately, there were some problems, one of which is the traveling life was something she didn't like. She wanted him to settle down. He really couldn't because of the
Hmm.
type of career he was in. So that was a big problem. And she also didn't necessarily like a lot of his, you know, jazz band associates or swing associates. Um, so they got divorced in 1942. They got remarried in 1946. And in between, even though Gene did have some other relationships during that period in between, he and Ethel were seen a lot out in public dating. So it was kind of weird. They're divorced, but they're dating. And they were in all the gossip columns. And there was a will they, won't they kind of thing about, well, will they get remarried? And they did get remarried. And so Jean, they were married until she tragically died of a brain aneurysm. She was only about 44 years old, and it was the end of 1955, and she just dropped dead. That was a very sad thing. Um,
Hmm.
so that's their story in a nutshell.
Thank you for joining us today and for giving us a little peek into the master of drums and his life. It's so fascinating and amazing, and the kind of influence he had, even even to the present. You
Yes.
know,